Today, we'll be discussing one of the creepiest and most mysterious places on Earth. The Nahanni Valley in Canada, also known as the Valley of the Headless Men. There are countless theories and speculations about what goes on there, but few places have as many incidents or theories as this one. We'll explore a few mysterious incidents that have occurred in the valley, and in part 2, we'll dive into its history, mythology, and the many theories surrounding the area. And believe me, the number of theories is staggering. So, northern Canada, specifically the Northwest Territories, is a vast, almost uninhabited wilderness of dense forests, mountains, wide rivers, lakes and swamps. This is the land where Captain Franklin starved to death during his polar expedition across Canada. If you haven't seen my video on this topic, I highly recommend it. It will help set the mood. Within this hostile wilderness lies an area covering 18,000 square kilometers called the Nahanni Valley. Since 1976, it has been declared a national park. But don't let that mislead you. There are no tourist trails, attractions, or even proper roads leading into the park. The only way to access the valley is by chartered plane or by paddling up a swift river, a journey that takes weeks. It's incredibly difficult to reach, but stunningly beautiful, with wild nature preserved in its original state. Almost no one lives there, just a few trappers along the edges of the park. Occasionally, hunters venture into the valley, and even more rarely, tourists. Local indigenous tribes like the Dene refuse to enter the valley, believing it to be cursed. We'll talk more about what the indigenous people say in the next episode. For now, let's dive into the origins of this valley's sinister reputation. We'll only be discussing known facts. The first documented incident occurred in 1898, when a group of 6 prospectors, armed with supplies, tools and weapons, set out into the valley in search of gold. This was during the height of the gold rush. The group hoped to find an untouched vein of gold, but they disappeared without a trace. At the time, no one paid much attention. People frequently vanished in the Canadian wilderness, and no one even started a search for the missing prospectors. However, a few years later, a hunter stumbled upon an unusual find, a small camp and the remains of the prospectors. The most peculiar part was that the skeletons were clutching weapons, but their heads were missing. The skulls had been neatly placed at the feet of the bodies. Even these strange details didn't raise much alarm. It was assumed that animals had scavenged the bodies, which is why the skulls were separate. A small mention of the incident appeared in a Yukon newspaper, but no names were given for the dead. Now let's move on to the second incident, which we know much more about. In 1904, 3 brothers, Willie MacLeod, Frank MacLeod and Charlie MacLeod, living in the Northwest Territories, decided to head into the Nahanni Valley to look for gold. The gold rush had slowed down, and they logically assumed that since almost no one had been in the valley, they might find untouched gold deposits. After a long and difficult journey on sled dogs and homemade boats, they finally reached the Flat River, which flows through the valley. Despite its name, the Flat River is far from gentle. It's turbulent and filled with rapids. But the brothers made camp and began prospecting. They set up sluices in the river to catch gold. After a few days, they had collected a significant amount of gold and decided to return to town to stake their claim before anyone else did. They also planned to hire workers and buy more equipment to work the area on a larger scale. They loaded their gold into a boat and began heading down the river. However, their boat hit a rock on one of the rapids and was smashed to pieces. The gold sank, as did most of their supplies. The brothers made it to shore unharmed, but had to return to their camp empty-handed. A few days later, they built a new boat and left the valley with nothing. Back home, Willie and Frank started making plans to return to the Nahanni Valley, but their older brother Charlie, still shaken from their experience, refused to go back. The younger brothers invited their friend Robert Weir to join them, and in the spring of 1905 they headed back to the valley. Charlie stayed behind in town, waiting for their return. Months passed, then half a year, and eventually 2 years went by, but the brothers never returned. Charlie, still not too worried, thought they might have found gold and decided to stay and mine as much as possible. But after 2 years, he began to worry. He gathered a search party and ventured into the valley. They travelled up the entire length of the flat river and found no trace of the brothers until finally they made a grisly discovery. On the riverbank they found 2 headless bodies near a tent. One body's hand was outstretched towards a rifle propped against a tree. Inside the tent they found the second body, also missing its head. Based on the personal items in the camp, Charlie identified the bodies as his brothers. However, Robert Weir was never found. Months later, parts of a skeleton were discovered downstream which might have belonged to Robert, but no proper investigation was conducted at the time. What had happened in the camp remained a mystery. The only clue was a message carved into wood that read, "We found a fine prospect." Yet there was no sign of gold or mining equipment in the camp. The police concluded that the men had starved to death and animals had dragged away their heads. But Charlie McLeod openly dismissed this theory as nonsense, pointing to the burnt clothing found on the bodies. He believed the men had been attacked by local tribes. However, the police refused to investigate further. Some people speculated that the men had found gold and that Robert Weir had killed his companions and escaped with the treasure, only to drown in the river. The area surrounding the Nahanni Valley began to gain a reputation for being cursed, and soon earned the nickname the Valley of the Headless Men. Despite the growing fear, the area also attracted many gold prospectors, some of whom referred to it as the Canadian El Dorado. A few years later, in 1913, a prospector named Martin Jorgensen decided that the eerie stories wouldn't stop him from getting rich. He hiked into the valley on foot, planning to scout out gold deposits. He built a small cabin along the flat river and wrote to his partners that he had struck gold. However, months later his cabin was found burned to the ground, and Jorgensen's headless body was discovered nearby. The official conclusion was another accident, but his missing head remained a disturbing mystery. After the McLeod brothers' tragic deaths, the valley's sinister reputation only grew, and it became known as the Valley of the Headless Men. However, this didn't stop other gold prospectors from being drawn to the area. In 1913, a prospector named Martin Jorgensen decided to defy the eerie legends and search for gold. After a difficult journey, he set up a small cabin along the flat river. He wrote to his companions that he had found a promising gold vein and that they should prepare to come and help. However, before his partners could return, Jorgensen's cabin was found burned to the ground, and his headless body was discovered nearby. The official explanation was that an accident had caused the fire, but his missing head remained a disturbing mystery. Years later, in 1921, an experienced hunter named John O'Brien was found frozen to death near a campfire in the Nahanni Valley. Oddly, his body was not in a position typical of someone freezing to death. His face appeared peaceful and he was holding a matchbox, as though he had suddenly frozen in place. Those who found him said it looked as if something had abruptly frozen him where he sat. The strange occurrences continued. In 1926, a woman named Mela Ferty disappeared while hunting in the valley. She had been traveling with her cousin and a group of dean hunters when she went missing. After several days of searching, the hunters found pieces of her torn clothing hanging from tree branches, suggesting she had been running and discarding her clothing in a panic. Despite a thorough search, her body was never found. Some months later, an indigenous hunter claimed to have seen a naked woman running on all fours near the edge of a cliff, her eyes wide with madness. However, authorities dismissed the claim and the case remains unsolved. Among the most colourful characters associated with the valley was a man named Yukon Fisher, a prospector who fled into the wilderness after a violent bar fight. Fisher lived in isolation, avoiding people as much as possible. Hunters who occasionally crossed paths with him described him as having developed the instincts of a wild animal. His ultimate fate remains unknown. In 1929, three more prospectors, George Gilroy, Eddie Hay, and Angus Hall, entered the valley in search of gold. A conflict arose between the men, and Angus Hall stormed off into the forest. That night, his companions saw him climbing a nearby ridge, but he never returned. Despite several search efforts, his body was never found. The strange deaths and disappearances in the Nahanni Valley continued into the 1930s. In 1935, two trappers, Joe Mann and Bill Epple, were dropped off in the valley by a dog musher. When the trappers failed to return, a search party was organized. They found their camp burned to the ground, but the men's bodies were never recovered. A similar incident occurred in 1936, when a group of hunters found a recently used campfire near the junction of the Flat and South Nahanni rivers. They followed clues such as chopped trees and abandoned gear, but again, no bodies were found. In 1940, the body of a man named William Gilbertson, an aircraft engineer, was found dead in his cabin in the Nahanni Valley. The cause of his death was never determined. The same year, a forester named Ollie also vanished in the valley. In 1945, a geologist named Walter Tully was found dead, his body severely decomposed. Strangely, animals had gnawed away at his head, leaving the rest of his body untouched. In 1946, another prospector named Frank Henderson returned from the valley with 30 ounces of gold and a terrifying story. He had been traveling with a partner named John Patterson, but during their journey, Patterson disappeared. Henderson reported hearing strange wailing sounds coming from the river at night. His indigenous guides were so terrified that they abandoned the expedition, and Patterson was never seen again. In 1957, a man named Leonard Bronkhorst was found dead on the shores of the South Nahanni River, his body face down in a pool of his own blood. In 1962, a pilot named Angus Blake Mackenzie vanished while flying over the Nahanni Valley. Despite a 40-day search, neither he nor his plane was ever found. Later that same year, another plane carrying pilot Ernest Gwenon and 3 passengers went missing. The wreckage was eventually found, but the bodies were never recovered. The disappearances continued into the 1970s. In 1978, an American paranormal investigator named Hank Mortimer led an expedition into the valley. Despite being well prepared and equipped with modern gear, the team vanished after their radio operator sent a distress call, describing a terrifying void emerging from the cliffs. Mortimer's body was later found decapitated. The last reported incident I could find dates to 2005, when two men, David Horse and Frederick Hardy, disappeared during a weekend fishing trip. Their bodies were later found, one in dense bushes, the other in the Nahanni River. Although the official cause of death was listed as hypothermia, the men's families noted disturbing signs. There were bullet holes in the floor of their cabin, and one of the men's shirts had a large hole that appeared to be from a shotgun blast. The police, however, refused to investigate further. These are just a few of the incidents that have occurred in the Nahanni Valley, also known as the Valley of the Headless Men. Over 50 people have disappeared in the valley, many of whom were found without their heads. Some of the heads were never found, while others were placed at the feet of the bodies. In the next episode, we'll discuss the history of the valley, indigenous folklore, and of course, the many theories about what might be happening in this eerie place. Be sure to subscribe so you don't miss it. Leave your thoughts in the comments. I'd love to hear your theories about what could be going on in the Nahanni Valley. And don't forget to like the video and share it with your friends.